George R. R. Martin takes inspiration for his world building from many different places, from ancient cultures and different folklores to the Three Stooges and the Muppets. So it would certainly be in line for him to have taken some inspiration from a culture that is, relatively speaking, in his backyard. George currently makes his home in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and down in that area of the country there's a Native American tribe called the Navajo who tell legends of people who can become something called a skinwalker. Which, if you think about that in terms of A Song of Ice and Fire, it does really sound a lot like Skin Changers, and they do seem to do some very similar things. I know that everyone watching this video has at some point or another asked themselves, does skin changing take any inspiration from skin walking? I know that you've asked yourself that because something relatively close to that is going to be in the title of this video, so you had to have at least had the thought cross your mind if you ended up here. Well, I can't personally confirm whether or not you can gain the magical power to become a skinwalker. I can confirm that when you become a YouTuber, you gain the magical power to put a question in someone's head and then answer it immediately in your video. And so that's what we're going to be discussing today. I'm going to be trying to get to the bottom of just how similar these things are, and spoiler alert, if there wasn't something there, I probably wouldn't be making the video now, would I? Now, I am far from an expert on Native American legends and lore, but there is this YouTube channel that I quite enjoy, and the link to this video will be in the end card. If you make it to the end of this video, you can go check out my source for yourself. But I'm basing a lot of this on a video from the Lore Lodge, which covered the Skinwalker and what the actual legends behind them really are. Many of the things that they brought up come from the work of researcher Clyde Kluckhohn from way back in the 1930s and 40s, and this research was done by going and talking directly to the Navajo and learning about these legends directly from the source, whereas nowadays a lot of stuff you'll hear about skinwalkers from like different social media has been sort of TikTokified and turned into like a pop culture folklore sort of thing. And a lot of the stuff that you may hear about it doesn't really actually seem to come from the Navajo originally at all. Like, for one particularly relevant example, the Skinwalker wasn't some sort of demonic entity that shapeshifts and things like that. They were just straight up people who gained this specific power through a specific initiation ritual. The power they gained also wasn't to, like, fully possess an animal or something like that. They would wear the skin of a dead animal and take on its form and gain many of its powers, like being able to run really fast or things like that. When they weren't out there wearing the skins of beasts to take on some magical sort of powers, they were many times just integrated into normal society and fulfilling roles in that society, which we'll talk about a little bit as we go here. This is obviously pretty similar to wargs or skin changers in A Song of Ice and Fire, where they're sort of, at least in the wildling society, just integrated into society, being used as scouts and things like that. And pretty much everyone just knows that they're normal people with this extra little magical power to take the form of an animal. When they aren't actively in this animal form, though, they're just regular people. A little bit off topic, but one of my favorite things that I learned from that Lore Lodge video is that apparently some skinwalkers would literally just kind of use this to scam people. Like, they would take on their beast form and then they would go and poison people, and then they would heal those people or have a friend heal those people because oftentimes these people were medicine men essentially for their societies. There's something that's pretty darn funny to me about the idea of taking on this dark, horrible magical power and then essentially using it for little scams to make money on the side. The Lore Lodge video, which once again will be in the end cards of this video, does a really good job of breaking all that sort of stuff down, so I would definitely recommend you check it out after this if this is the type of thing you're interested in. A lot of this stuff, as it was being brought up in the video, I kept thinking, dang, a lot of the details of this initiation ritual are starting to sound really familiar to something that happens to Bran Stark in A Song of Ice and Fire, specifically his initiation to becoming a Greenseer. At the very least, it seems passingly related in the way that George will often do, where he'll take little aspects of things, but he won't ever like copy it fully directly. He'll just take cool parts of it and mix and mash it together into what he's actually doing in his story. So you get something that is like adjacent to Skinwalker initiation, but not necessarily copying it beat for beat. Sort of like how he's talked about how he handles making religions, where he'll take little aspects of one religion and another religion and he'll mash them together into something cool. You can see many of his different religions throughout the world have aspects of Christianity, but none of them are a direct copy. The Faith of the Seven is probably the closest, but you still have things that are basically like a play on baptism in the Ironborn religion, for example. And also, while I think that the Song of Ice and Fire is on some level a play on the idea of Ragnarok and the cycle of resetting for the world, I don't think we should necessarily be looking at the story of Ragnarok to just like find a one-to-one comparison and be like, oh, well, this character is like that character, so that means they're going to do exactly what that character does. As I said, he mixes and mashes. So in the case of skinwalkers and skin changers, it's, as I said, not a direct connection. You don't need the initiation ritual to become a skin changer. We have plenty of those in the books who haven't gone through this, but we have Bran going through this initiation ritual to become a Greenseer that is somewhat reminiscent of the Navajo initiation to becoming a skinwalker. So I'm not going to list every single little detail. Again, you can go check out the Lore Lodge video after this, and I definitely recommend you do, but I'm now going to list off several things that I think will just stand out to anyone who's read A Song of Ice and Fire, and specifically when you think about Bran's journey, they're really going to stand out. The initiation ritual for becoming a skinwalker would involve a ceremony that takes place far out in the wilderness inside of a cave. Inside this cave, you are surrounded by the dead, corpse flesh, as well as heads that supposedly line the walls and watch with dead eyes. This ceremony would be led by witches who were not gendered. This wasn't a gendered term in Navajo society. And in fact, they were actually sort of fulfilling a role in society similar to what many people would think of as a medicine man, and the title for this wasn't Medicine Man, it was actually Singer. So this initiation in a cave was actually led by a bunch of singers. Much like the children of the forest are called those who sing the song of the earth in their own language, and then inside the cave they're referred to as the singers. This initiation ceremony is supposed to involve breaking pretty much every taboo in Navajo society, and one of the parts of the initiation is for the person who's being initiated to kill either a relative or a close friend and eat their flesh. Jojen paste anyone? You can see how, as I'm hearing all of this, I can't help but think of Bran Stark, who's isolated in a cave far away from the rest of society, learning magic from singers, breaking every taboo even without knowing it, and potentially eating the flesh of someone close to him as part of his initiation ritual to awaken his powers and wed him to the trees. In the Lore Lodge video, Aiden then goes on to tell the particularly disturbing story of an unsuspecting teenage boy who is brought by these witches to a cave far away and put through this initiation ritual without knowing what he's getting into. Eventually, as he realizes what's going on inside this cave, he becomes horrified and starts to plan his escape, which eventually he does, and he eventually starts running away from these witches. But he knows that once they transform into their skinwalker form, they would be able to catch up to him, so he climbs up into a dead pine tree to hide. So basically, you have this young boy who is brought to a cave, put through this initiation ritual unknowingly, but at some point, he realizes all of this is much darker than what he actually thought he was getting into, and he decides to leave and uses a tree to escape. I don't know how closely that is going to mirror Bran Stark's entire journey, but it certainly does have a lot of similarities, and I wouldn't necessarily be surprised if eventually he did have to try and escape this cave using some sort of tree magic. And as I said, George definitely likes to mix and mash things, so we're not necessarily like sure that the singers are going to turn out to be evil, but that is a pretty common theory in A Song of Ice and Fire. It's something that I've believed in the past and sort of go back and forth on. I could definitely see it being the case. So yeah, it might be the case that at some point Bran is going to figure out how horrifying this sort of initiation actually is, and it's going to be the singers that he's going to be trying to escape from, just like the boy in this story. One of the things that people have definitely noticed is that Bran is basically breaking all of the skin changer taboos that he has no idea about because he's never been like properly educated in how to be a skin changer. But he is starting to break these taboos already, most notably warging into another human in the case of Hodor, and breaking all sorts of taboos is part of this skinwalker initiation ritual that supposedly gives you all this magical power. So potentially it could be useful in George's world as well for leveling up this dark magic power of being a skin changer. And as I've speculated in the past, I think that Bloodraven, Cold Hands, and these singers are basically leading Bran through breaking all of these taboos and doing a lot of this dark stuff without Bran's knowledge. The most obvious example of this would be Jojen paste, right? If they did indeed feed a good close friend to Bran, they didn't tell him that they were doing it, and if it's part of this initiation ritual, like the Skinwalker initiation ritual, Bran going through this initiation without knowing what he's doing may for some reason be important for, Bran becoming maybe a good person with all of this magical power, whereas normally this magical power would only be reserved for people who are willing to do these dark, horrible things. I've speculated in the past that basically Bran being a good person with this power is going to be very important to the world of A Song of Ice and Fire at some point going forward, right? Like if you have a system of power where only terrible people can actually take the power, maybe what you would require is someone who is a good person to have that power and use it for good. And maybe the way that Bloodraven and these children of the forest are bringing this about is by sort of tanking all of the bad juju that comes with, murdering a child and feeding it to his best friend. They're taking that on themselves rather than putting it on Bran's soul or consciousness or whatever. So Bran can remain somewhat innocent but still become very magically powerful. In fact, if all of these really dark magical things are what's required to, on some level or another, awaken your full Greenseer powers, Bran having all of this done without his knowledge may actually make him the first ever decent person to end up with all of this magical power, which would leave him as the perfect person to sort of deconstruct this whole system and build something better. Which, if you've watched a lot of my videos about how I think all these books are going to end, that is roughly what I think Bran is going to be doing. Specifically with Jojen paste, it just rings so true to me that if it is indeed the case that Bran has eaten Jojen, why on earth would he do that? Well, if George is drawing some inspiration from the Navajo skinwalker initiation ceremony, then suddenly that makes quite a bit of sense. Even though I've long understood that the evidence for Jojen paste is pretty strong and it's a good theory that's likely to be revealed to be the case in the next book, I've always still just wondered, like, why did he do this? This seems a little bit over the top. But if this is, as I said, what George is drawing his inspiration from, then suddenly it feels a little bit less out of nowhere. The whole idea of using sacrifice to gain magical power is well established in George R. R. Martin's world, but I just never really understood, like, okay, why eat Jojen though? But if the idea is that the sacrifice and the consumption of someone close to you is something that's like an incredible sacrifice and incredibly powerful to gain this weird, dark, magical power, well, maybe that's what's being set up for Bran here. And I have talked about in the past how I think Jojen might actually even know that this is his fate. He knows the day that he's going to die, supposedly, and he's sort of really sad and depressed when he gets to the cave. And it does seem like the end is getting near for him, and Mira's been telling him to fight his fate. But it might be the case that him choosing to sacrifice himself to save the world in this way is something that he's already decided he's going to go through with, and I've talked in the past about how potentially even that self sacrifice might even be an important part of this ritual, who really knows? Sort of Christ like, where he could try to fight his fate and run away from it, but instead he's choosing to go through with sacrificing his own life to save all of humanity. So good on you, Jojen, if that is indeed the case. Also, according to that Lore Lodge video, the idea is that you would use the body of either a close friend or a relative in this initiation ceremony, which is why I do keep some little idea in the back of my mind like, okay, if Benjen ended up with the children of the forest, did they have his body still lying around in the cave and did they mix that into the paste as well? I don't fully rule that idea out. If you want to see what I think about Benjen, check out the last video on my channel before this one. Another interesting question that sort of pops into my mind, just thinking aloud about all of this, if this is indeed the case, Bloodraven did go north to the wall with the Raven's Teeth, who were a bunch of people who were incredibly close to him, and I wonder if perhaps it is part of a human becoming a Greenseer for them to eat the brain or whatever of someone who's close to them. Did Bloodraven eat one of the Raven's teeth? I don't really know, but he did have people who went to the wall with him who were very loyal to him and very close to him, and I would assume that some of them disappeared with him as well. Given everything we know, I wouldn't be too surprised if at one point or another he ate some Raven's Teeth paste. So just in terms of the overall topic of the video, I think that I'm leaning towards a heavy yes. There is probably some connection between skinwalker lore and legends and the idea of becoming a skin changer, or more specifically a greenseer, in A Song of Ice and Fire. George R. R. Martin seems like a pretty well-read guy who's up on a lot of these different legends and takes inspiration from many different places, so it would make a lot of sense to me that he would also be aware of Native American legends, especially ones that come from so close to his home. The incredible similarities about the initiation ritual taking place in a cave full of people called singers, being surrounded by the dead and corpse flesh and things like that, and even right down to a potential explanation for why on earth Bran would have had to have eaten Jojen paste. All of this stuff lines up and makes me think that there is definitely some sort of connection there, but I'd love to hear what any of you guys think about that down in the comments. If this ends up being the case, then potentially we have a whole nother avenue of lore and legends to take a look at to try and find some answers to different A Song of Ice and Fire mysteries. We've talked a lot about how there's inspirations in things like Norse mythology and lots of old literature and things like that, And maybe Native American legends is another place that we can start looking and maybe finding some more cool connections. If you yourself are Native American or you have family who is and you're familiar with all these sorts of legends, I would love to hear from you down in the comments if there's anything else that you feel like could be an interesting connection that maybe we as a community should look into. At the risk of sending you all down a YouTube rabbit hole that's not of my own making and doesn't send me AdSense money, I would also definitely highly recommend, as I said, that you check out the Lore Lodge video on the Skin Changer lore and see if there's any other connections that you have pop out to you that I might have even not noticed. Thank you all very much for watching. Remember to like and subscribe before you go, and check out one of those videos that should be on your screen in the end cards right now. Also, a quick shout out to all of you because this is the first video that I've recorded since the channel hit 25,000 subscribers, which is 1/4 of the way to me getting a cool little plaque to hang on my wall. And that means that if each of you tell 3 friends to subscribe to the channel, and each of them tell 3 friends to subscribe to the channel, and each of those people tell 3 friends to subscribe to the channel, we can eventually build a giant pyramid-shaped structure that will encompass the entire world, all being subscribed to me on YouTube, which would be pretty neat. So thanks again for all the support, and I'll be back with something else very soon.